The fundamental problem development economics aims to address is, why is there a difference in development across nations, across continents, and how best to reduce this divide? Now, the general standardized belief on how to reduce this divide is through foreign aid, is through the policy of jumpstarting developing nations' economies through aid or loans or kind of things like that, so that their economy gets up and running kind of with a boost, a kickstart, and then they can get off and running and repay the debts, or they will just be in a better place because they've had this kind of jumpstart initiative. And there's a lot of kind of economic literature and academia that supports this belief. And today's question we want to kind of look at is, well, has it been successful? Have developing economies, been promoted and, encouraged to develop through initiatives from NGOs and government organizations? And what have been the drawbacks? Specifically, what's the corruption level in these developing economies looking like? How much of the actual loan and the intended kind of payout has actually gone to what is aimed to be gone to? Or has it kind of diverged? The first paper we're going to look at is titled US Food Aid and Civil Conflict by Nunn. Now, basically, what the paper aims to look at is one type of aid that the US donates through USAID is agricultural aid, by basically donating food to African nations. And the aim of the paper is to kind of try and look at the unintended consequences of donating food to these underdeveloped countries. What happens apart from the kind of general assumption that it decreases starvation, which is a very noble cause, which is a huge problem. But it kind of looks at what happens post the food entering the country. Now, they do use a lot of fancy things, but the main one they use is something called instrumental variables, which basically kind of tries to explain for the X variable. It's really interesting, look it up. It's a really cool technique. They use them in pretty much every development economics paper, but basically they monitor surplus of grain that the US has. So basically, in very good agricultural production years, USAID donates more food because there's more surplus. It's pretty much that. And they also look at which countries are in the good books of America. So there's certain countries the US won't donate food to. So now you've got kind of a standardized, even playing field. And what it basically finds is that when the agricultural aid comes into a country, it has a couple effects that are unintended. First of which is it makes conflicts more severe and prolongs them. So it basically means if without the food aid entering the country, the civil war or conflicts with militias or rebel groups would actually be shorter, and if it was a smaller conflict, with the food aid it becomes larger. And this is on the basis that food aid coming into a country, will often be rounded up by militant groups and then used to feed militias, prolonging a conflict. And also it's an initiative to start a conflict and prolong it because they're now fighting over the aid. So now we have this paper where, you see a very, noble cause, but you see there's a lot of unintended consequences. Conflict is definitely not helping development. So there's an argument to be made that this food aid is actually decreasing development because now there's more wars and militias and all those sort of things in developing economies. So we're going to discuss the kind of the conclusion and results after we look at our next paper. So this second paper is titled Elite Capture of Foreign Aid Evidence from Offshore Bank Accounts. Now this paper has a bit of really cool kind of history, as cool as academic economics gets. They got the data that they used for this from the World Bank. And when they came back with the results, the World Bank was like, no, you can't publish this. This is very, very bad for our reputation. And kind of as a Hail Mary, The Economist just leaked out the paper to the press, and so then they were finally able to publish it. So it's kind of like a secret thing that was leaked to the press in economics, which is pretty rare. But basically what the paper aims to do is look at what happens when World Bank loans come into countries and what happens to kind of the financial systems that happen in those countries. And what they found was when a loan comes in, the following quarter sees a huge spike of outflows to tax havens. So basically, there's a huge spike to offshore bank accounts from within the country's elites. So money comes in, there's money coming out in the next quarter to places where it's more stable. So there's lots of tax havens like in the Caribbean or Switzerland. And so this is basically evidence for corruption at a massive scale within World Bank loans. The findings they find is 7.5% of foreign aid is immediately leaving the country. And that's the lower end. If you think about it, elites of these countries will spend their money internally. They'll also spend their money kind of going shopping or on a fancy holiday. So it's 7.5% leakage, corruption on the low end, which is startling numbers. And they also found that larger aid disbursements, so larger loans, basically lead to larger exoduses. So it means that, if a country secures a massive loan, they're going to take even more than they would if it was a smaller loan proportionally. And also, they find really strong effects in autocratic regimes and weakly governed states, which is what you'd expect. There's more corruption in autocratic and weak states. So, now that we've kind of looked at two papers that kind of find some unintended negative consequences of aid and the kind of current system of aid, where does this leave us? So, after looking at those two papers, it's pretty clear that our current system of aids are not perfect, and there is some improvements to be made. And one of these large improvements is the idea proposed by William Easterly, an economist, and it's basically stating that these countries don't need financial and economic and institutional aid because providing it unorganically won't help them. What is needed is to provide the incentives for them to do it on their own. It's basically saying if they were destined and, were on track to be developed, they would have already done so because there would have been the incentives. What we need to do is change the way we look at aid. We don't need to give it to them to jumpstart. We need to provide incentives for them to do it on their own. And it's a much more progressive and kind of more solidifying rationale behind aid, giving autonomy to developing economies. It's not necessarily like a trying to baby Big Brother situation. It's saying, look, these are incentives. We're going to try get your economy to have these incentives so that you can organically develop and, become a developed country, which is a really fascinating thing. And I think it holds a lot of weight. And the second kind of part to this is, if we are trying to promote these incentives, it's very clear that the incentives aren't going to be homogenous. Every country needs different incentives. Every country needs different forms of trying to stimulate this development. And this is kind of the second part, where it's financial aid and economic aid is all very one size fits all, which is definitely not the case if you hear stories of people going out to these countries and trying to help. It's a very complex and dynamic environment. And somewhere where kind of just throwing a bunch of money at it and hoping it sticks is not the policy that's best suited. And also there's lots of other things that are kind of, contributing. There's trying to figure out ways to reduce corruption. What systems in place will reduce corruption? So there's lots of really cool papers. There's one I'm reading here, which is called Monitoring Corruption, Evidence from a Field Experiment in Indonesia, which basically aims to look at what kind of systems will help reduce corruption. How can we stop corruption using, a top-down approach, a bottom-up approach? Really cool paper, really interesting read. But I just want to finish on a couple of my thoughts about it, where, I talk about this with a lot of people, and there's the kind of general consensus that it doesn't work, that, all these institutions haven't done well, they've done harm. And I think it's overlooked in the fact that it's kind of a situation where it's like something's better than nothing. I'd rather a world where, if we look at the World Bank study, let's say even 80% was leaving the economy and not helping out in the initiated way. I'd rather an 80% loan to help build schools and promote, education, rather than nothing. I think there's a moral and duty as human beings to help out. And so I think the kind of constant trying to figure out what's the best policy, how to, incentivize, how to best tailor our aid to help help our fellow humans is definitely the best approach. And that approach doesn't come by just shutting down and kind of just trashing these aid agencies. They've got noble goals, and I think with extra minds on all of it, these kind of initiatives to help development will really work. And hopefully that's a world we can live in really soon.